He walked into the cafe like any other customer, the soft chime of the doorbell barely noticed by the bustling staff and patrons. Dressed simply, with a quiet demeanor, he didn't command attention, at least not at first. But there was something about him, an air of quiet confidence, that set him apart if anyone cared to notice. The waitress, balancing 2 trays and glancing at her long list of pending orders, spotted him taking a seat by the window. Her brow furrowed slightly as she noticed his youthful face and casual attire. To her, he looked like someone who might order a coffee, linger for hours, and leave a measly tip. Rolling her eyes, she muttered under her breath, "Just another one of those." She approached his table briskly, her tone curt. "What can I get you?" The young man looked up, his polite smile unfazed by her abruptness. "Just a latte, please," he replied in a calm, even tone. Her sigh was audible as she jotted it down, her irritation barely concealed. Little did she know, her hasty words and dismissive attitude were about to lead to a revelation that would leave her, and the entire cafe, speechless. The cafe was a cozy retreat tucked into a quiet corner of the city, a favorite spot for locals seeking a brief escape from their busy lives. Its warm, inviting ambiance was carefully curated. Soft Edison bulbs cast a golden glow over rustic wooden tables, while shelves lined with potted plants and books gave the space a lived-in charm. The air was thick with the rich aroma of freshly brewed coffee, mingling with the faint sweetness of pastries baking in the kitchen. Patrons filled the small tables, their chatter blending with the occasional clink of ceramic cups. Laughter and low conversations created a gentle hum that gave the cafe its lively yet laid-back vibe. Near the counter, a barista worked diligently, steam rising from the espresso machine as they prepared orders with practiced precision. Despite the cafe's welcoming appearance, there was an undercurrent of judgment that wasn't immediately obvious. Some of the staff, though polite on the surface, often assessed customers with subtle glances and unspoken assumptions. To them, the regulars were familiar faces worth their warmth, while others, newcomers or those who didn't fit the aesthetic, were treated with a touch less enthusiasm. Among the staff was the waitress, a sharp-eyed young woman who prided herself on efficiency. She moved quickly between tables, her smile rarely reaching her eyes. To her, every customer was a task to complete, not a person to engage with. When the young man entered, she noticed him immediately. Dressed in a simple jacket and jeans, he didn't seem to match the usual cafe crowd. Professionals typing away on laptops, couples sharing desserts, or groups of friends snapping Instagram-worthy photos. To her, he looked out of place, a fleeting presence who wouldn't leave much of an impression. He'll probably just order a coffee and sit there for hours, she thought, her mind already categorizing him as someone unimportant. The atmosphere of the cafe didn't change, but for the waitress, this one customer stood out, not for who he was, but for who she assumed him to be. And it was this assumption that would soon unravel in a way she could never have anticipated. The waitress. She moved through the cafe with the efficiency of someone who had worked there long enough to master every corner. Balancing a tray in one hand and taking orders with the other, she appeared confident, even commanding, as she navigated the bustling space. Her hair was pulled back into a practical ponytail, her apron neatly tied, and her sharp eyes seemed to notice everything, except for what truly mattered. Years of dealing with difficult customers had honed her ability to size people up at a glance. To her, every patron fit into a category: the generous regulars, the high-maintenance complainers, and the ones who lingered too long without ordering much. Her judgments weren't malicious, but they were swift and often unkind. She prided herself on her ability to handle the cafe's fast pace, but her sharp tongue and quick assumptions sometimes created an invisible barrier between her and the people she served. "I don't have time for nonsense," she often told herself, her tone unapologetic. But in her rush to stay ahead, she rarely stopped to see her customers for who they really were. Baron Trump. At first glance, Baron Trump seemed like any other young man. Dressed in a simple jacket and jeans, he entered the cafe with an easy stride, his movements unhurried and composed. He carried himself with quiet confidence, the kind that didn't demand attention but invited it nonetheless. His demeanor was polite, almost reserved, as he scanned the room for an open seat. Settling near the window, he placed his phone on the table and glanced outside, seemingly lost in thought. There was no entourage, no fanfare, just a calm presence that many would overlook. What set Baron apart wasn't immediately visible. It was in the way he held himself, unbothered by the hustle of the cafe around him. His blue eyes were sharp but kind, observant without being intrusive. Though he was used to being noticed for who he was, he never acted entitled or expected special treatment. For Baron, this was just another cafe, and he was just another customer, content to enjoy a latte and watch the world go by. But for the waitress, unaware of his identity, he was someone who didn't quite fit her expectations, and in that moment, her snap judgment would set the stage for an encounter neither of them would forget. The cafe buzzed with its usual energy as the waitress darted between tables, her tray stacked with cups and plates. Out of the corner of her eye, she noticed the young man sitting near the window, his simple attire making him blend into the background. She sighed softly, her mind already forming assumptions. Probably another one of those lingerers, she thought, adjusting her apron before heading his way. She barely looked up as she approached his table, her voice curt and devoid of warmth. "Are you ready to order?" she asked, pen poised over her notepad. The young man looked up, meeting her gaze with a polite smile. "I'll have a latte, please," he said in a calm, even tone. Her pen scratched quickly across the pad, and she didn't bother repeating the order back. "Anything else?" she asked, her tone flat. "That's all for now, thank you," he replied. She gave a brief nod and walked away without another word, muttering under her breath. Could have just said that when he sat down. Baron remained composed, unbothered by her attitude. He glanced out the window, seemingly unaware of the subtle glances some customers were starting to give him. When his latte was ready, she returned, setting the cup on his table with a bit more force than necessary. "Here you go," she said brusquely. "Thank you," he said again, his tone unchanged. As she walked away, her sigh was audible enough for nearby customers to notice. One of them, an older man sitting at the counter, frowned slightly and leaned toward the barista. "Is that who I think it is?" he asked, his voice hushed. The barista glanced toward Baron's table, their eyes widening in recognition. "Oh my, isn't that Baron Trump?" The older man nodded. "Sure looks like him." Word began to spread quietly among the patrons. Subtle glances turned into whispered conversations, and the atmosphere shifted. The waitress noticed the change, her sharp instincts picking up on the way customers seemed more focused on the young man by the window. She furrowed her brow, glancing toward the counter where the barista and another staff member were murmuring. "What's going on?" she asked, her voice tinged with irritation. The barista hesitated before leaning closer. "I think that's Baron Trump," they whispered. The waitress's heart skipped a beat. She turned toward the young man, who was calmly sipping his latte, oblivious to the growing realization around him. Her stomach sank as the weight of the situation hit her. She replayed the interaction in her mind, the curt tone, the dismissive attitude, the barely concealed frustration. Her confidence faltered as the pieces fell into place. She had treated him as though he were an inconvenience. But now, she realized the truth. The quiet murmur among customers grew louder, the whispers carrying a mix of surprise and disapproval. The waitress's face flushed with embarrassment as she realized that her snap judgment had not only been wrong, but might now have consequences she couldn't predict. For Baron, the cafe was just another stop in his day. But for the waitress, the moment was unraveling into a situation far bigger than she had anticipated. The atmosphere in the cafe began to shift as whispers rippled quietly through the room. Customers leaned toward one another, their voices low but filled with curiosity. "Is that Baron Trump?" someone murmured, their eyes darting to the young man seated near the window. "Are you sure?" another replied, their tone tinged with disbelief. What would he be doing here? The barista behind the counter exchanged wide-eyed glances with a fellow staff member. It's him, isn't it? The barista whispered. I saw a photo of him recently. He looks exactly like that. Oblivious to the growing attention, Baron sat calmly, sipping his latte and glancing occasionally out the window. His composed demeanor only added to the intrigue. The other customers, now acutely aware of who he might be, watched with a mix of awe and hesitation, unsure whether to approach or simply observe. At the center of it all, the waitress began to notice the subtle shift in the room. She caught snippets of hushed conversations as she moved between tables, her confidence faltering with each word she overheard. Do you think she knows who he is? I can't believe she was so rude to him. Someone should tell her before she embarrasses herself further. Her chest tightened as her gaze instinctively returned to the young man by the window. He hadn't reacted to her dismissive tone earlier, and now she wondered why. Could it really be him? The unease gnawed at her as she approached the counter. What's going on? She asked the barista, trying to sound casual despite the growing lump in her throat. The barista hesitated, glancing nervously at the young man before leaning in. I think that's Baron Trump, they whispered, their tone urgent. The waitress's breath hitched. What? She whispered back, her voice tinged with disbelief. Look at him, it's him, the barista insisted, nodding subtly toward Baron's table. The realization hit her like a wave. The curt greeting, the audible sighs, the subtle yet unmistakable rudeness. Each moment replayed vividly in her mind. Her face flushed with embarrassment as her heart sank. The whispers among the customers grew louder, their gazes darting between the young man and the increasingly uneasy waitress. She turned away, gripping the edge of the counter to steady herself. What do I do? She muttered under her breath. Before she could decide, the manager appeared beside her, their expression a mix of disbelief and urgency. Do you know who you just served? They asked, their voice low but firm. The waitress nodded slowly, her stomach churning. I didn't realize, she stammered. The manager sighed, their tone softening slightly. Well, now you do. You need to fix this before it gets worse. The waitress swallowed hard, her hands trembling as she glanced back at Baron's table. He was still there, quietly finishing his latte, seemingly unaware, or perhaps simply unfazed, by the ripple effect his presence had caused. The weight of the moment pressed down on her as she realized the enormity of her mistake. She had treated him as though he were just another inconvenience, dismissing him without a second thought. Now, with the truth revealed, she felt the sting of her own actions in a way she hadn't anticipated. As the room buzzed with a mix of surprise and awkwardness, the waitress knew she couldn't ignore what had happened. She took a deep breath, her nerves threatening to overwhelm her, and prepared to make amends. But the question lingered. Would an apology be enough to undo the damage she had caused? The café, once filled with the comforting hum of daily life, had become a stage for a lesson in humility and grace. And as the waitress took hesitant steps toward Baron's table, all eyes were on her, waiting to see how this story would unfold. The waitress stood frozen at the counter, her thoughts swirling with regret and embarrassment. She prided herself on being sharp, efficient, and able to handle the pressure of a busy café. But now, as she replayed her earlier actions, the curt tone, the dismissive sighs, the lack of basic kindness, her confidence felt hollow. She couldn't deny it anymore. She had let her assumptions dictate her behavior. To her, Baron had been just another young customer who didn't fit her mental image of someone worth her effort. But now, knowing the truth, she saw how wrong she had been. Her chest tightened as she glanced at Baron, still sitting calmly at his table, finishing his latte with the same quiet demeanor he had displayed since he walked in. He hadn't raised his voice or demanded special treatment. Instead, he had handled her rudeness with grace, a stark contrast to her own behavior. What kind of person am I? She thought bitterly. He was polite the whole time, and I couldn't even give him the same respect. The weight of her actions grew heavier as she turned to the manager. "I need to apologize," she said softly, her voice laced with guilt. The manager nodded. "That's a good start," they replied, their tone firm but understanding. With trembling hands, the waitress adjusted her apron and took a deep breath. She felt the stares of other customers as she made her way to Baron's table, each step a reminder of how much she had misjudged him. "Excuse me, sir," she began, her voice shaky. Baron looked up from his cup, his blue eyes meeting hers with the same calm composure he had shown all afternoon. "I wanted to apologize for how I treated you earlier," she continued. "I wasn't fair to you, and I made assumptions that I shouldn't have. It was wrong, and I'm truly sorry." Baron's gaze softened as he listened. He let a moment of silence pass before he spoke, his voice steady and kind. "It's okay," he said simply. "We all make mistakes." His words, so calm and sincere, took her by surprise. She had expected anger, or at least annoyance, but instead, he offered her understanding. "Thank you for saying that," she replied, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'll do better from now on." Baron gave a small smile and nodded. "That's all anyone can do," he said. The simplicity of his response left her speechless. He could have made a scene or pointed out her behavior to the entire cafe, but instead, he had chosen to rise above it. His maturity and grace were a lesson she hadn't expected to learn that day. As she walked back to the counter, the waitress felt a mixture of relief and resolve. The interaction had humbled her in a way nothing else could have. She realized that respect and kindness should never depend on who a person appears to be. They should be given freely, to everyone, without exception. Baron's quiet forgiveness lingered with her long after he left the cafe. It wasn't just an act of grace. It was a reminder of how powerful kindness can be, even in the face of judgment. And for the first time in a long time, the waitress felt a genuine desire to approach her job and her life with a little more humility and a lot more heart. The cafe buzzed with a faint hum of conversations, but the attention of the patrons was unmistakably drawn toward the young man seated near the window. Baron Trump, composed and unbothered, remained an island of calm amid the growing whispers and curious glances. Meanwhile, the waitress stood near the counter, her heart pounding as she prepared herself to face him. Her hands trembled slightly as she adjusted her apron, her mind racing with a mix of regret and determination. "I have to make this right," she thought, though the weight of the moment made her steps feel heavier. As she approached Baron's table, the surrounding patrons grew quieter, their conversations fading as they turned their attention to the unfolding scene. She stopped just short of the table, taking a deep breath to steady her nerves. "Excuse me, sir," she began, her voice barely above a whisper. Baron looked up from his phone, his blue eyes meeting hers with a calm curiosity. She hesitated for a moment, then spoke again, her voice trembling. "I wanted to apologize for the way I treated you earlier. I was rude, dismissive, and it was completely unfair. You didn't deserve that, and I'm truly sorry." The room seemed to hold its breath as her words hung in the air. The waitress's face was flushed with embarrassment, her eyes reflecting the sincerity of her regret. Baron studied her for a moment, his expression unreadable. Then, to her surprise, he smiled gently and said, "Thank you for saying that. It takes courage to admit when you're wrong." She blinked, taken aback by his calm and gracious response. I really appreciate your understanding," she stammered. "I'll do my best to treat everyone with the respect they deserve from now on." Baron nodded, his voice steady and kind. "Everyone deserves respect," he said softly. "It's never too late to start." The simplicity of his words carried a profound weight, resonating not only with the waitress, but also with the other patrons who had been quietly observing. A murmur of approval rippled through the room, and the waitress felt a wave of relief mixed with newfound resolve. As she stepped back, she noticed the subtle shift in the atmosphere of the cafe. The awkward tension that had filled the space earlier had melted away, replaced by an air of quiet admiration. Baron's maturity and grace had left a lasting impression on everyone present. The manager, who had been watching from a distance, approached the waitress as she returned to the counter. "You handled that well," they said, their tone approving. The waitress nodded, still feeling the impact of the moment. "I learned a lot today," she replied softly. Baron finished his latte and rose from his seat, offering a polite nod to the staff before making his way to the door. The cafe fell silent for a moment as he left, the chime of the doorbell marking his departure. The waitress watched him go, a mix of gratitude and humility settling in her chest. She knew she couldn't undo her initial actions, but Baron's forgiveness had given her the chance to grow and change. As the door closed behind him, the cafe slowly returned to its usual rhythm, but the lesson lingered. For the waitress, it was a turning point, a moment that reminded her of the power of kindness, humility, and the grace to admit when you're wrong. The cafe settled back into its rhythm after Baron's quiet departure, but for the waitress, things would never be the same. As she stood by the counter, watching the door close behind him, she felt a mix of relief and determination. The weight of her earlier actions had been lightened by his forgiveness, but the lesson he left behind would stay with her forever. That evening, after the cafe had emptied, she gathered her courage and approached the manager. "I want to thank you," she said, her voice steady but emotional, "for letting me handle this on my own. I needed to face it, and I've learned something important today." The manager nodded, their expression softening. "We all make mistakes," they replied. "It's what you do after that counts." The waitress carried that sentiment with her as she cleaned tables and prepared for the next day. She reflected on the moments leading up to her apology, replaying Baron's calm demeanor and kind words in her mind. "Everyone deserves respect," he had said, and she realized how often she had failed to extend that simple courtesy in her rush to judge. From that day forward, her approach to her job changed. She made a conscious effort to treat every customer with kindness and dignity, regardless of how they looked or what she assumed about them. The sharp edge in her demeanor softened, replaced by a genuine warmth that didn't go unnoticed by her colleagues or the patrons. Baron's quiet departure had left a ripple effect throughout the cafe. The staff, who had initially been drawn into the drama, began reflecting on their own attitudes toward customers. The patrons, too, carried the memory of his grace and humility with them, sharing the story with others as an example of how a single moment of kindness could change someone's perspective. As the cafe lights dimmed that night, the waitress felt a sense of peace she hadn't known before. She couldn't undo her past actions, but she could ensure they wouldn't define her future. Baron's visit had been unexpected, but the lesson he left behind had transformed not just her, but the atmosphere of the cafe itself. It was a small but powerful reminder that respect and kindness had the power to change everything. Have you ever found yourself judging someone based on appearances or assumptions? This story reminds us how easy it is to let quick judgments cloud our actions, and how powerful a simple act of kindness can be in making things right. The waitress learned a valuable lesson that day. Respect and humility should be extended to everyone, regardless of who they appear to be. And Baron Trump's grace and composure showed us that forgiveness is one of the greatest strengths a person can have. Take a moment to reflect on your own interactions. How can you approach others with more kindness and understanding? A smile, a kind word, or even a moment of patience can change someone's day, and perhaps even their life. If this story inspired you, share it with someone who might need a reminder of the power of compassion. Don't forget to like this video and subscribe to our channel for more stories that inspire, uplift, and challenge us to be better. Together, we can build a community that values respect and kindness above all. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next story.